For over 2000 years, the Indian subcontinent has witnessed a remarkable historical pattern. From the Persians and the Greeks to the Central Asian powers, and eventually European empires, India was not just discovered by chance, it was pursued again and again. And this raises a fundamental question: why India? Hello everyone, my name is Aditya Vashisht, and in this episode, we explore one of the most fascinating questions in world history. Because when we step back and look at the global history carefully, a striking pattern begins to emerge. The history of the world does not show this kind of sustained external interest everywhere. Large parts of Africa, the Americas, and even Southeast Asia entered the global power politics much later. But India is different. India appears early, repeatedly, and persistently in the political imaginations of the world. And that is not a coincidence. In fact, economic historian Angus Madison, in his work Contours of World Economy from 1 to 2030 AD, highlights India's enormous long-term economic weight in the global system. Now, we must be very clear about one thing. Invasions do not happen randomly. Empires do not cross mountains, deserts, and oceans for lands that do not matter. Power always moves towards value. And if we look closely, India was never a forgotten land waiting to be discovered. It was already known to traders, to travelers, to scholars, and to the rulers, long before the armies ever arrived. Greek accounts, Roman trade records, Arab geographies, Persian chronicles, and later the European writings all point to one thing: India was visible, connected, and valuable. And this challenges a very popular but deeply misleading assumption that India was invaded simply because it was weak or divided. That explanation is incomplete and frankly historically shallow, because many regions in history were politically fragmented, yet they did not attract sustained foreign conquest. What makes India different is not just politics. It is its civilisational and economic weight. Historians across ancient and medieval periods consistently describe India as a land of extraordinary agricultural productivity, a centre of advanced manufacturing and artisanal skill, a region of large population capable of sustaining powerful states, and a key hub in the long-distance trade networks connecting the East and the West. This is why India enters world history not as a footnote, but as a prize. So the real question is not why was India invaded? The real question is, why was India worth invading again and again? And to answer that, we must go beyond kings and battles. We must understand the deeper forces that made India central to the global power struggles. That is the journey we begin today. If we truly want to understand why India attracted the attention of the world, we must begin not with armies, but with production. Because long before Central Asian conquerors arrived, or European companies began their journey through the sea, the Indian subcontinent was already one of the largest centers of economic activity in the world. And the roots of this prosperity lay in geography. But its real expression was seen in agricultural surplus, demographic strength, and artisanal excellence. Let us begin with the most fundamental layer: agriculture. The Indo-Gangetic plains, nourished by the great river systems, the Indus, the Ganga, the Yamuna, and their vast network of tributaries, formed one of the most fertile regions in the entire Eurasian world. Unlike many river systems, dependent purely on uncertain rainfall, India benefited from a rare ecological combination: snow-fed Himalayan rivers, seasonal monsoon rains, and highly diverse agroclimatic zones. This diversity made something possible: multiple cropping patterns and the ability to sustain large, stable populations. By around 600 BC, northern India had already undergone significant transformation: iron-based plug agriculture, expansion of cultivation, and the emergence of surplus-producing regions. Now, this is critical to understand. Agricultural surplus is not a minor historical detail. It is the very foundation of everything that follows: states, taxation, cities, standing armies. And this has been powerfully explained by noted historian Irfan Habib in his work The Agrarian System of Mughal India, where he shows how productive agriculture and surplus formed the very backbone of the imperial strength. Thus, without surplus, no empire, whether indigenous or foreign, can survive. But surplus does not remain in the fields. It moves, it circulates, and it builds networks. From the modern period onwards, both textual and archaeological evidence reveal a highly organized system: structured revenue administration, active trade guilds, and thriving long-distance commerce. And we are not relying on imagination here. Even the Roman sources speak about India. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his famous work Naturalis Historia, 1st century CE, complained about something very specific: the steady drain of Roman gold to India. But in exchange for what? Spices, textiles, gemstones, the luxuries that the Roman world deeply desired. This is not an exaggeration. It is recorded in the Roman accounts. By the early centuries, Indian pepper had become a luxury commodity in the Mediterranean markets. Cotton textiles from India were in high demand across West Asia, and ports like Gaza, modern Bahruch, were deeply integrated into global maritime trade networks. India, therefore, was not isolated. It was deeply connected to the trans-regional circuits of trade and exchange. And when these networks expand over centuries, they create something far more significant: economic weight. Modern economic historian Angus Maddison attempted to quantify this long-term strength, and his estimates reveal something remarkable, something that fundamentally changes how we see India in the world history. According to Angus Maddison, for nearly 1,500 years, from the beginning of the Common Era all the way to the early modern period, India was among the largest economies in the world. At certain points in history, India alone accounted for nearly 1/4 of the world's GDP. This is not just a number, it represents the scale, productivity, and a vast functioning economic system. And when such a region exists, prosperous, productive, and globally connected, it does not remain unnoticed. It becomes a magnet. But India's importance was not just limited to agriculture alone. Its real strength also lay in what it produced beyond the fields. Across the subcontinent, generations of artisans developed highly skilled skills in textiles, in metallurgy, stonework, shipbuilding. Indian textiles, in particular, were world renowned. Fine cotton fabrics, especially muslin from Bengal, were so delicate that they were often described as woven air. The anonymous author of The Periplus of Erythraean Sea in the 1st century CE provides detailed account of Indian ports and trade goods describing a thriving commercial world, deeply connected to the Red Sea and Mediterranean markets. And it wasn't just textiles. Indian metallurgy had reached remarkable levels of sophistication. High quality steel, later known as Wood's steel, was exported and highly valued across West Asia. What we see here is not isolated craftsmanship, it is a complex economic ecosystem where agriculture production supports the population supports the labor, and the labor produces high value goods. And high value goods attract high value attention. By this point, the pattern becomes clearer. India was not just producing for itself, it was producing for the world. Spices from the Malabar coast, textiles from Bengal and Gujarat, and precious stones from central India were in demand across regions, from Rome to Persia to Southeast Asia. And here lies a crucial insight. Foreign powers did not first come to conquer India, they came to trade. When European powers like the Portuguese, the Dutch, and later the British arrived in the Indian Ocean, they were not arriving in an unknown world. They were entering an already vibrant, competitive, and highly profitable trade network. Their initial goal was simple: access. Access to spices, access to textiles, and access to wealth. Conquest came later. Trade came first. And all of this was supported by something even more fundamental: people. India's large population base was not just statistic, it was a source of strength. It provided the labor, it sustained the agriculture, and it formed the very backbone of the armies. Which brings us back to Chanakya. The treasury depends on the land, and the land depends on the people. When we put all of this together, fertile land, agricultural surplus, skilled production, global trade, and demographic strength, we begin to see the full picture. India was not invaded because it was weak. India was invaded because it was valuable. And once a land becomes valuable, it inevitably becomes contested. For a long time, a colonial era argument suggested that India was a geographically isolated civilization, protected by mountains and cut off by seas. But modern historical studies reject this completely. India was not isolated, it was buffered, yet connected, protected, yet accessible. As American historian Burton Stein argues in A History of India, India's geography created multiple regional cores, that is, centers of population, agriculture, and power, interconnected through trade and political networks. Similarly, German historians Hermann Kulke and Dietmar Rothemund in A History of India emphasize a crucial point. India's ecological diversity did not divide it, it connected it. Mountains, deserts, rivers, coasts, these were not barriers. They were zones of movement, exchange, and interdependence. And to understand this more clearly, we must examine the geography itself. The first and perhaps the most significant is the Khyber-Bolan corridor. These were not accidental invasion routes. They were civilizational highways connecting the Iranian plateau, Central Asia, to the Indus Basin. Through these passes came the Indo-Aryan migrations, Achaemenid Persians under Darius I, Greeks under Alexander the Great, Kushans, Ghaznavids and Ghurids, Timurids and Mughals. This is not a coincidence. This corridor made the Indus region a geopolitical hinge. linking Central Asian steppes, Persian imperial systems, and Gangetic agrarian states. As Professor Romila Thapar notes in Early India, these routes were not just military, they were routes of cultural transmission and political expansion. But crossing into India was only the beginning. What lay ahead was one of the most fertile regions in the world, the Indo-Gangetic Plains, a vast alluvial landscape with extensive river systems, high agricultural surplus, dense population, and terrain suitable for cavalry movement. This was not just land, this was power. It is here that great empires took root: the Mauryas, the Guptas, the Delhi Sultanate, and later the Mughals. As historian Irfan Habib explains, in the agrarian system of Mughal India, the productivity of this region financed standing armies and centralized states. Geography did not just enable conquest, it enabled empire building. Now, often we imagine the Deccan as a dividing line. But historically, the Deccan was not a barrier, it was a bridge. The Vindhyas did not stop expansion, they only slowed it. Mauryas, Satavahanas, Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, Delhi Sultans, Mughals all crossed Deccan and governed this region. It enabled long distance trade, access to mineral resources, and strategic fortifications. Historian Burton Stein, in the New Cambridge History of India, Vijayanagara, describes the Deccan as a segmentary political zone, meaning the power here was not fully centralized. It, in fact, operated through networks of authority, local chiefs, and layered control, which made the region both resilient and adaptable. Now, when we step back and look at all this, a clear pattern emerges. India's geography did not isolate it, it connected it. Its mountain passes invited movement, its plains sustained empires, and its internal regions enabled the expansion. But this is only part of story, because beyond land there was also the sea. If the northwestern passes opened India to Central Asia, the seas opened it to the world. The Indian Ocean was not a barrier, it was a highway of exchange. As noted historian K.N. Chaudhary explains in Trade and Civilization in Indian Ocean, this region functioned as an integrated economic system long before European dominance. From the eastern coasts of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and to the western shores of India and further to Southeast Asia, a dense network of maritime trade connected these regions. Indian merchants exported spices, textiles, precious stones, and in return, gold, horses, and luxury goods flowed in. The Periplus of Erythraean Sea provides detailed descriptions of these trade routes and ports, confirming India's deep integration into the Indian Ocean commercial systems. Ports like Bharuch, Muziris, and Calicut were not just isolated towns, they were global nodes of commerce. But what made this vast maritime network possible? The answer lies in the winds. The monsoon system, the predictable seasonal winds, allowed the sailors to travel across the Indian Ocean with remarkable regularity. The knowledge of these wind patterns, often associated with Hippasus, the Greek navigator, often associated with the discovery of monsoon wind system over the Indian Ocean, transformed the maritime trade. This meant something extraordinary. Trade was not random. It was systematic, cyclical, and reliable. Historians like K.N. Chaudhary and Fernand Braudel emphasize that such environmental patterns acted as a natural infrastructure for the global commerce. The monsoon did not just shape the climate, it shaped history. Now, if the seas connected India outward, what about the mountains in the north? The Himalayas are often described as an impenetrable barrier, but that is only half the truth. They were definitely a barrier, but they were also a filter and a channel. While large scale movement was restricted, the passes and the routes still allowed the cultural and commercial exchanges, particularly with Tibet and Central Asia. As historians like Romila Thapa point out, geographical features in India rarely created absolute isolations. Instead, they shaped the direction, the pace, and the nature of interaction. When we bring all these elements together, the passes of the northwest, the fertile Indo-Gangetic plains, the Deccan Plateau, the Indian Ocean networks, and the Himalayas system, a clear picture begins to emerge. India was not isolated by geography. It strategically positioned within it. The geography did not determine history mechanically, but it created the conditions within which history unfolded. And all these conditions made India accessible, connected, and valuable. And once a region becomes all three, it does not just attract trade, it attracts power. That is when the contact turns into contest. Before India became the theatre of large-scale medieval invasions, it was already deeply embedded in the trans-regional political, economic and cultural networks. This period, roughly from 6th century BC to the 7th century CE, is best understood not as an age of invasions, but as an era of contact, interaction and integration. As Professor Romila Thapa argues in Early India, early encounters were less characterized by destructive conquest and more by gradual absorption into the existing systems. The very first major political contact comes from the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC. It became one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Balkans and North Africa to the Indus Valley. Under Darius I, around 518 BC, regions like Gandhara and parts of Indus Basin were incorporated into the empire as satrapies. Now, these were administrative provinces governed by satraps, acting as the imperial representative of king. The French Iranologist Pierre Briand, in his work From Cyrus to Alexander, highlights the deeper significance of this interaction. Introduction of imperial administrative models, especially the satrap system, standardized taxation mechanisms, possible Aramaic script influences, and even the inclusion of Indian troops within the Persian armies. In fact, the Behistun inscription of Darius provides explicit reference to Hindush as a province of the empire. Now, what we are witnessing here is not a destructive invasion, but early imperial integration. India was not being discovered. It was already a part of the larger political and economic world. The next major episode builds directly upon this Achaemenid connection. The campaign of Alexander the Great in 326 BC, one of the history's most renowned military leaders, who after defeating the Achaemenid Empire advanced into the northwestern frontiers of India. But we must be precise here. His conquest was brief, his control limited, and his withdrawal inevitable. Yet the consequences were far-reaching. It opened the diplomatic links between India and the Hellenistic, that is the Greek world, and created a power vacuum in the northwest. And it is this particular vacuum that sets the stage for the rise of India's first great empire, the Mauryas. The vacuum created in the northwest after the withdrawal of Alexander the Great did not lead to chaos, it led to consolidation. Out of this moment emerged one of the most powerful political formations in Indian history, Chandragupta Maurya. Under his leadership, guided by Chanakya, the Mauryan Empire unified large parts of Indian subcontinent. And for the first time, as Professor Upender Singh notes in A History of Ancient and Medieval India, this marks the first instance of large-scale political unification in the subcontinent. But what is equally significant is how this empire engaged with the outside world. Historian Radha Kumud Mukherjee, in his Chandragupta Maurya and His Times, highlights that Chandragupta concluded a treaty with Seleucus I Nicator, exchanging territories and even establishing marital alliances. Now, this is critical. The expansion of power did not rely solely on warfare, it was achieved through diplomacy and negotiation. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes was sent to the Mauryan court at Patliputra. In his work Indica, he provides detailed accounts of administration, society, and governance. Please note that these are not the observations of a land in chaos. They are descriptions of a highly organized and functioning state. Once again, contact leads not to collapse, but to structured integration. After the Mauryas, the northwestern regions witnessed the emergence of new political actors, among them the Indo-Greek rulers. Now, these were not merely foreign invaders ruling from a distance. They, in fact, became part of the subcontinent's political and cultural life. The most prominent among them, Menander I, a powerful ruler whose influence extended across regions of the present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Historian A.K. Narayan in the Indo-Greeks highlights Menander's extensive coinage, coins inscribed in both Greek and Kharoshthi, reflecting a deliberate blending of linguistic and cultural traditions. His reign also reflects the patronage of Buddhism and the emergence of Greco-Buddhist artistic traditions. The Buddhist text Milinda Panha records the philosophical dialogues between Menander and the monk Nagasena. These dialogues are not incidental. They represent a deep engagement between Greek philosophical inquiry and Buddhist thought. This is not conquest. This is intellectual exchange. Thus, Indo-Greek rule demonstrates something fundamental. External groups did not remain outsiders. They adapted, participated, and became part of the system. When we look at this phase, from the Mauryan consolidation to the Indo-Greek participation, a clear pattern emerges. Early political contacts with India were not defined by destruction. They were defined by diplomacy, accommodation, and cultural synthesis. And yet, this process of integration reaches its most expansive form in the next phase, the rise of Kushans. The processes of interaction and integration that we saw under the Mauryas and the Indo-Greeks now reach their most expansive form. With the rise of Kushan Empire, originating from Central Asia, the Kushans established one of the most powerful empires spanning across the regions of Central Asia, Northern India. Under the rulers like Kanishka, the empire extended from the Oxus region across the Indus basin into the Gangetic plains. But what makes the Kushans historically significant is not just their territorial reach, it is their role in connecting the worlds. The Kushans occupied a strategic position along the great trade networks of the ancient world. These routes, often referred to as the Silk Routes, linked India with Central Asia, China, and the Mediterranean world. Control over these routes meant more than economic gain. It meant influence over the flow of goods, people, and ideas. Under the Kushan rule, we see the expansion of long distance trade, movement of artisans and merchants, circulation of coinage across the regions. Now, this was not isolation, this was global integration, ancient in form but modern in implication. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Kushans lie in the realm of ideas. Under Kanishka, Buddhism received significant royal patronage. The Fourth Buddhist Council, traditionally associated with his reign in Kashmir, marks an important moment in the development of Buddhist thought. His court became the center of learning, attracting thinkers such as Ashwaghosa, Nagarjuna, Charaka, Vasumitra. From here, Buddhism spread beyond India into Central Asia and further into China. We also see the emergence of Gandhara art, a striking blend of Greek artistic forms and the Indian religious themes. This is not the erasure of culture, it is their fusion. When we step back and look at this entire phase, from the Achaemenids to the Alexander, to the Mauryas, to the Indo-Greeks, to the Kushans, a clear and consistent pattern emerges. These were not isolated invasions. They were part of a broader process of interaction, adaptation, and integration. Early Indian history reflects a remarkable capacity to absorb the external influences without losing its civilizational core. External groups did not remain outsiders. They became participants, contributors, and eventually part of the system itself. But this raises an important question. If early contacts were so integrative, then why does the nature of interaction seem to change in the early medieval period? When and why does contact begin to look like conquest? For centuries, as we have seen, India's interaction with the outside world were shaped by contact, adaptation, and integration. From the Achaemenids to the Indo-Greeks to the Kushans, external groups entered the subcontinent and became part of its political and cultural fabric. But around the early second millennium AD, something begins to change. The nature of these interactions becomes sharper, more extractive, and more disruptive. Now, this is not a sudden break. It is a gradual transformation from integration to intervention. As historian Romila Thapa explains, early medieval transitions in India must be understood not as isolated invasions, but as changes in political economy and state formation. Similarly, historian Richard M. Eaton, in his work India in the Persianate Age, argues that many early incursions were driven less by religious motives and more by the logic of revenue extraction and political expansion. Now, to understand this turning point, we must first understand the context. The regions to India's northwest, Central Asia, Afghanistan, were undergoing significant political change. The decline of older empires, the rise of new Turkic powers, and the intense competition for resources created a highly unstable political environment. In such conditions, expansion towards resource-rich regions becomes almost inevitable. And India, with its agricultural surplus, temple wealth, and urban centers, presented an attractive target, not because it was weak, but because it was valuable. It is in this context that we encounter Mahmud of Ghazni. Mahmud's campaigns into India in the 11th century are often remembered in purely religious terms. But historical evidence presents a more complex picture. As historian Richard M. Eaton notes, these expeditions were largely raids aimed at wealth extraction. Temples, often targeted during these campaigns, were not just religious centers. Temples were also the repositories of immense economic wealth. This does not mean religion played no role, but it suggests that economic motives were central. Mahmud conducted multiple raids, entering, extracting wealth, and returning to Ghazni. These were not attempts to establish long-term rules. They were strategic incursions for revenue. To understand these raids more clearly, we must understand the role of temples in early medieval India. Temples were not just places of worship. They functioned as centers of economic accumulation, wealth, land ownership, and political legitimacy. As historians like Romila Thapa emphasize, temple desecration in this period must also be seen in the context of state power and symbolic assertion. Attacking a major temple was not only about wealth, it was also about demonstrating dominance, which means these actions operated at multiple levels: economic, political, and yes, at sometimes religious. So what we see in this phase is not a sudden collapse of earlier pattern, but a shift in emphasis from integration to extraction. But this phase of raiding does not remain static, because soon the objective itself begins to change. From wealth to power. The raids of Mahmud of Ghazni marked an important phase, but they also revealed a limitation. Raiding generates wealth, but it does not create lasting political control. Each campaign required fresh mobilization, repeated incursions, and offered only temporary gains. For a more stable and continuous flow of resources, something more was needed. Not raids, but rule. It is at this moment that we encounter Muhammad of Gaur. Unlike Mahmud, Muhammad Ghori's campaigns were not limited to plunder. They were aimed at political control. The battles of Tarain, particularly the second battle in 1192 AD, marked a decisive shift. With the defeat of Prithviraj Chauhan, the foundations were laid for sustained Ghurid presence in North India. This was not a raid followed by withdrawal. This was occupation, consolidation, and expansion. But Muhammad Ghori himself did not remain in India permanently. Instead, his generals, particularly Qutubuddin Aibak, took forward the process. And this is where something fundamentally new emerges: the establishment of permanent ruling structure. As historian Sunil Kumar in The Emergence of Delhi Sultanate argues, this period marks not just conquest, but the creation of new political institutions. And these included military bureaucratic governance, use of Persian as administrative language, land revenue systems adapted to Indian conditions. This was not merely an extension of Central Asian models. It was a hybrid system, shaped by the interaction with the existing Indian structures. This brings us to a critical analytical point. Historians like Romila Thapar and Sunil Kumar caution against viewing this particular period as a simple story of invasion. Instead, it must be understood as a phase of state formation. New elites entered the subcontinent, but they did not operate in isolation. They instead engaged with the local power structures, existing agrarian systems, and regional political traditions, which means even this phase of conquest contains elements of adaptation and integration. So, what we see here is a decisive transformation from Mahmud's raids aimed at wealth extraction to Ghori's campaigns aimed at territorial control, from revenue to rule. But even this does not fully explain the nature of the new phase, because alongside political and economic motives, another dimension becomes increasingly visible: the role of religion in political power. Now, this is often the most debated aspect of medieval Indian history, and also the most misunderstood. Religion did play a role, but it did not operate in isolation. As historian Richard M. Eaton argues, political actions in this period must be understood within the framework of state formation, legitimacy, and resource control. To understand this more clearly, we must revisit the role of temples. As Professor Romila Thapa emphasizes, temples were deeply embedded in the political economy of the time, which means targeting a temple could serve multiple purposes. It could be economic, that is, securing wealth. It could be political, that is, undermining the rival authority, and symbolic, that is, asserting dominance. And yes, at times, it could also carry religious meaning. But reducing it to a single dimension would be historically incomplete. Thus, religion was part of this matrix, but not the sole driver. Power in history is rarely one-dimensional. Now, when we step back and look at this entire transition, a clear shift becomes visible. This was not merely a series of invasions. It was the emergence of a new political order. In fact, a turning point where India remained valuable, but the way power engaged with it was completely transformed. By the early 13th century, the nature of political power in North India underwent a decisive transformation. What began in the previous phase as raids and limited territorial footholds now evolved into stable and institutionalized rule. With the establishment of Delhi Sultanate, external entrants were no longer occasional invaders. They became the state builders within India. And therefore, the key question now changes. Not why India was invaded, but how India was governed after conquest. The political base of Delhi Sultanate was laid by Qutbuddin Aibak, a former slave of Muhammad of Ghor, who through loyalty and military skill rose to the rank of a general. After the assassination of Muhammad Ghori in 1206 AD, Aibak asserted the independence in India and proclaimed himself the Sultan at Lahore. Now, this moment is crucial because it marks the transition from delegated authority to sovereign rule within India. His rule also reflects the early cultural expression of the new state. Construction of Qutub Minar in Delhi, the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, and Adhai Din Ka Jhopda at Ajmer. These were not just monuments. They were assertions of political presence and cultural transition. Over time, the Sultanate was ruled by successive dynasties: Mamluks, Khaljis, Tughlaqs, Sayyids, and Lodhis. What began as a conquest was now becoming a durable political system. But what kind of state was this? The Delhi Sultanate was fundamentally a military fiscal state, which means political authority dependent on control over the revenue. Revenue came from agrarian surplus. An agrarian surplus dependent on control over land and peasants. As historian Irfan Habib in the Essays in the Indian History emphasizes, the strength of Sultanate rested not on plunder alone, but on its ability to systematically extract the surplus through land revenue systems. And this is a critical shift from episodic extraction to institutionalized revenue control. Wealth was no longer seized, it was organized, measured, and sustained. And one of the most important tools that made this possible was the Ikta system. Under this system, land was not owned by nobles. Instead, revenue rights were assigned to military commanders known as Iktadars. In return, they were responsible for maintaining the troops, ensuring the administration, and supporting the Sultan. As historian Satish Chandra explains, this system achieved three critical objectives: administrative decentralization, military readiness, and fiscal continuity. This was not feudal fragmentation. It was carefully structured system of delegated control under central authority. Power was shared but never surrendered. But governance alone does not secure power. It must also be enforced. And that is where the Sultanate reveals its most assertive phase. By the 13th and the early 14th centuries, the Delhi Sultanate had established its foundations. But consolidation did not mean stability. The Sultanate faced multiple and simultaneous challenges: internal rebellions, factional struggles among the nobles, and perhaps most critically, repeated Mongol invasions from the northwest. These were not minor disturbances. They posed an existential threat to the very survival of the state. In such a situation, power could not remain loose. It had to become centralized, disciplined, and decisive. It is in this context that we encounter Alauddin Khalji, one of the most powerful rulers of Delhi Sultanate, whose reign marks a turning point in the nature of governance. Alauddin Khalji's policies were not arbitrary experiments. They were systematic responses to political and military pressures. As historian Satish Chandra explains, his measures must be understood in the context of defending the state and maintaining a large standing army. Also, one of the most striking features of his rule was the regulation of markets. Now, Alauddin Khalji introduced strict controls: prices of essential commodities, supply chains, and trade practices. And this was not economic idealism. It had a clear political objective: to sustain a large army at low and stable cost. As Professor Irfan Habib notes, such measures reflect the state's attempt to maximize control over the resources and regulate the economic life. This marks a significant development. Now the state is no longer extracting revenue. It is actively shaping the economy. Authority now extends from land to the market itself. Alongside economic control, military organization was strengthened. Alauddin Khalji expanded and disciplined the army. Branding of horses, dag, maintenance of descriptive roles, chehra, and stricter inspection systems. And these measures ensured efficiency, accountability, and direct control over the military. This reduced dependence on individual nobles and strengthened the central authority. The army was no longer just a fighting force. It became an instrument of the state. But the greatest threat to any ruler often comes from within. The nobility, powerful and ambitious, posed a constant challenge. Alauddin Khalji introduced restrictions on social gatherings, surveillance networks, and limitations on wealth accumulation. These were designed to prevent conspiracies, rebellions, and fragmentation of power. Now, what you'll have to understand is this represents a clear shift from shared authority to controlled and monitored power structures. Authority was no longer negotiated, it was asserted, enforced, and protected. But even the strongest states have limits. The Sultanate governed a vast and diverse territory, and direct control could not be uniformly enforced everywhere. Distance from the center, regional variations, and administrative constraints often restricted the reach of authority, which means the Sultanate was not an all-powerful uniform state. Its strength was real, but never absolute. In fact, much of the existing agrarian structure continued to function. Village-level institutions, local elites, and traditional systems of land management remained crucial to governance. As Irfan Habib explains in essays in Indian history, medieval states in India operated through existing agrarian frameworks rather than replacing them entirely. And this highlights a key feature: the state dependent on society, even as it sought to control it. Authority flowed from the center, but functioned through local realities. This brings us to an important conclusion. The Delhi Sultanate did not rely solely on coercion, on force. It also relied on cooperation with the local elites, incorporation of existing structures, and negotiated relationships. As historians like Satish Chandra and Sunil Kumar suggest, the functioning of Sultanate depended on a balance between central authority and local accommodation. Now, when we step back and look at the Delhi Sultanate as a whole, a complex picture emerges. The Sultanate was defined by consolidation, accommodation, and control. The Delhi Sultanate did not just conquer India, it learned to govern it. And yet, this system would evolve further because the next phase would take these processes of consolidation and adaptation to even greater scale. The Delhi Sultanate laid the foundations of political control in northern India, but its authority, while significant, remained limited in reach and uneven in structure. The next phase in Indian history would take the process much further, from a regional power to a subcontinental empire. This transformation begins with Babur. In 1526, at the First Battle of Panipat, Babur defeated Ibrahim Lodi and established the Mughal power in India. But like many earlier conquests, this was only the beginning. The real significance of the Mughal Empire lies not in its origin, but in how it was built, expanded, and stabilized. The early Mughal phase was far from stable. Babur's rule was short-lived, and his successor, Humayun, faced internal conflicts and external challenges. In fact, at one point, Mughal power was itself displaced. This was not yet an empire. It was a struggle for survival. The real consolidation begins with the rise of a remarkable ruler, Akbar, one of the most influential rulers in Indian history, under whom the Mughal Empire transformed into a durable and expansive state. Akbar's significance lies not merely in territorial expansion, but in institutional innovation and political integration. As historian John F. Richards argues in The Mughal Empire, the Mughal state under Akbar evolved into a highly organized and centralized imperial system. Under Akbar, the empire expanded across large parts of northern and central India. But expansion alone does not create stability, integration does. To govern such a vast empire, Akbar needed a system to organize authority. This led to the development of Mansabdari system. Officials known as Mansabdars were assigned the ranks that determined their status, responsibilities, and military obligations. This system ensured administrative efficiency, military organization, and direct linkage to the emperor. It reduced the autonomy of the regional elites while integrating them into the imperial structure. Authority was not fragmented, it was centralized, yet distributed. But no empire can survive without a stable economic base. The Mughal Empire was fundamentally a revenue based state. As Professor Irfan Habib explains in The Agrarian System of Mughal India, the Mughal state derived its strength from its ability to systematically extract agrarian surplus. Now, this marks a significant development. Revenue was no longer irregular, it became organized, measured, and institutionalized. And it is this system of revenue extraction that became the backbone of Mughal power. And at the heart of this system lay one critical foundation: agriculture. Professor Habib explains in The Agrarian System of Mughal India, the Mughal state was built upon the systematic extraction of surplus from agriculture. This was not arbitrary taxation, it was organized, measured, and regulated. The strength of the empire flowed from the land. To make revenue extraction efficient, the Mughal state introduced one of the most sophisticated systems of its time, the Zabt system. Developed under Akbar and refined by Raja Todamal, herein the land was carefully surveyed, measured using standard units, and classified based on productivity. The average yields were calculated, prices were standardized, and a fixed share of the produce was assessed as state revenue. Now, this brought predictability, both for the state and for the cultivators. As Professor Satish Chandra notes, these reforms ultimately helped create a more stable and rational revenue system. But revenue was not just about income. It was directly linked to the military and administrative power. The surplus collected from agriculture funded the army, the bureaucracy, and the imperial court. As John F. Richards explains, the Mughal Empire functioned as a fiscal military state, where the revenue sustained expansion and control. Now, this created a cycle. Revenue supported the army ensured the control, and controlled enabled further revenue extraction. Thus, it was self-reinforcing system of power. But this system did not operate in isolation. The Mughal state interacted continuously with agrarian society. Peasants cultivated the land. Zamindars acted as the intermediaries, and the state extracted its share. As Professor Irfan Habib emphasizes, Zamindars were not merely tax collectors, they were local power holders, embedded in the rural society. And quite often, this made the system complex, as it involved both cooperation and conflict. Despite its sophistication, the system was not uniform everywhere. Regional variations existed. Different crops, different ecological conditions, and varying local power structures all affected the implementation. Historians like Satish Chandra highlight that Mughal administration was flexible, adapting to the regional realities. This flexibility was a source of strength, but also a limitation. Control was extensive, but never absolute. So, what emerges in this phase is a highly organized system of revenue extraction, administrative control, and military support. The Mughal Empire was not just a political structure, it was a fiscal military system. But even this does not complete the picture. Because beyond administration and revenue, the Mughal Empire also shaped a broader process of civilizational integration. Integration, not in a modern political sense, but as a process of bridging the diverse regions, elites, and traditions into a shared imperial framework. As Satish Chandra argues, the stability of Mughal Empire dependent on its ability to incorporate different social and political groups. Empire survives not just by control, but by inclusion. And one of the most important aspects of Mughal integration was incorporation of local elites, particularly under Akbar. Rajput rulers and other regional powers were brought into the imperial systems. They were granted positions within the Mansabdari system, which allowed a degree of autonomy and integrated into the Mughal political structure. This ultimately reduced the resistance and strengthened the empire from within. As John F. Richards explains, this policy helped transform the Mughal state into a more inclusive and stable imperial system. Conquest brought territory, integration brought stability. But this integration was not limited to the subcontinent alone. The Mughal Empire was also a part of wider network of exchange across the Indian Ocean world. And as noted historian K.N. Chaudhary argues, in trade and civilization in Indian Ocean, the Indian Ocean functioned as a vast zone of commercial, cultural, and intellectual interaction, connecting regions from East Africa to Southeast Asia. And within this network, the Mughal Empire was not isolated. It was an active participant, connected through trade, movement of people, circulation of ideas. Which means Mughal integration was not just internal. It was part of a larger interconnected world. And alongside the political integration, cultural interactions also intensified. The Mughal period witnessed a rich phase of cultural exchange, Persian administrative traditions, Indian artistic and architectural forms, and intellectual exchanges across communities. These exchanges and interactions did not erase differences, but created new forms of expression and identity. And this was not a uniform synthesis. It was a layered and evolving process. Historians like Satish Chandra highlight that the Mughal period must be understood through both interaction and diversity. Unity here did not mean uniformity. Yet, even at its height, the Mughal Empire had its limits. Integration was significant, but not complete. Regional variations persisted, local identities remained, and tensions occasionally surfaced. Now, when we step back and look at the Mughal Empire as a whole, a clear pattern emerges. It represents the most advanced phase of political organization in pre-colonial India. A system built on organized revenue extraction, administrative sophistication, military strength, and elite integration. In fact, the Mughal Empire was not merely a ruling power, but a complex and integrated imperial system. Not just an empire, but a synthesis. And yet, even this powerful system would eventually face new challenges. Because the next phase of Indian history would not come from the land, but from the sea. Before we understand European expansion, we must first understand the world they entered. Because India was not isolated. It was a part of a vast, interconnected system of trade and exchange. As historian K.N. Chaudhary explains in Trade and Civilization in Indian Ocean, The Indian Ocean was a structured commercial zone, linking regions across East Africa, West Asia, India, Southeast Asia. Goods and people and ideas moved across these networks with a remarkable continuity. This was not a fragmented world, it was a well connected system. It is into this system that European powers entered. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached the Indian coast. This was not a discovery, it was an entry into an already functioning network. Soon, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, and the French all became part of this system. But they did not behave like earlier participants. Unlike the existing trading groups, the European actors were driven by a different logic, not just trade, but control over trade. As historian Om Prakash explains, in European commercial enterprise in pre-colonial India, the European companies increasingly aimed to establish monopolies rather than participate in open exchange. This created tension within the existing system. Trade was no longer shared, it was contested. This shift was made possible by another crucial factor, and that is the technology. European powers possessed advanced naval ships, improved navigation, and powerful artillery. As historian Tirthankar Roy notes, control over maritime routes allowed the Europeans to gradually dominate the long distance trade. This gave them an advantage, not necessarily on land, but decisively at sea. Whoever controlled the sea controlled the flow of the trade. Now, when we bring these elements together, a pattern begins to emerge. European entry did not simply add a new player in the system, it began to change the rules of the system itself. From open networks to controlled routes, from shared trade to monopolized commerce. This was not participation, it was the beginning of disruption. So, in this phase, we are not witnessing a simple arrival. We are witnessing the entry of a force that would gradually reshape the entire system. But how does this disruption translate into power? How does trade become control? Now, that transformation begins with a company, the English East India Company, established for commerce. Its early presence in India was limited to trading posts and coastal settlements. As historian Om Prakash explains, in European commercial enterprises in pre-colonial India, European companies initially operated within the existing commercial framework, but gradually sought to control the trade flows and conditions. This gradual shift from participation to control sets the stage for political expansion. A company beginning to act like a state. This decisive transformation begins in mid-18th century. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey, the company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal. This was not just a military victory, this was a political breakthrough. Control was now exercised, not just through trade, but through influence over governance. From trader to power broker. And this process did not stop at Plassey. In 1764, the Battle of Buxar, the company defeated a coalition of regional powers, and this victory firmly established the company's authority in eastern India. Political power was no longer indirect, it was becoming institutional. Influence turned into control. But the real foundation of power lies in revenue. And in 1765, the company obtained the Diwani rights of Bengal. This granted it the authority to collect the land revenue from one of the richest regions in India. And as Professor Habib reminds us, control over agrarian surplus is central to state power. This moment marks a structural shift. The company was no longer dependent on trade profits. It now controlled the economic base of power, from commerce to revenue sovereignty. With revenue in its control, the company could expand further, and thus it evolved into a fiscal military power. Revenue funded the army secured the territory, and territory generated more revenue. As historian Tirthankar Roy highlights, the company's strength lay in combining economic extraction with military expansion. This created a cycle of domination, more efficient and more extractive than earlier systems. Profit was no longer the outcome, it became the driving source of power. But what did this domination mean for India's economy? How did this new system affect the wealth, production, and society? And most importantly, who benefited and who paid the price? By the late 18th century, the English East India Company had established firm control over territory and revenue. But the nature of this control was fundamentally different from the earlier systems. The earlier regimes collected the revenue largely for sustaining the power within the region. But the colonial system was oriented outwards. This meant resources generated in India were increasingly directed beyond it. Revenue was no longer circulation, it became extraction. This brings us to one of the most powerful critiques of colonial rule, Dadabhai Naoroji. In his work Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, Naoroji systematically explained the phenomena of drain of wealth. Wealth produced in India was transferred to the Britain without equivalent economic return. Through various means like revenue remittances, profits of trade, salaries and pensions of officials, enormous wealth continuously flowed outward. This was not accidental. It was built on the structure of colonial rule. India was not just governed, it was drained. This extraction had deep consequences for India's economy. One major outcome was transformation of production systems. Traditional industries, particularly the textile, faced decline under the changing economic conditions. As Professor Tirthankar Roy points out, this process was complex, involving both decline in some sectors and reorientation in the others. Production was increasingly shaped by external demand and the global market forces. The economy no longer served itself, it served the external interests. And these changes were not limited to industry. The entire economic structure began to shift. Agriculture became more commercialized. Land relations were altered. And new patterns of dependency emerged. As Professor Om Prakash highlights, colonial policies reshaped India's economic organization in line with the global trade demands. Society too experienced a change in livelihoods, in social hierarchies, and in economic security. This was not just governance, it was transformation. But this transformation was not limited to economic structures alone. It also shaped, or in fact reshaped, the very fabric of Indian society. As historian C.A. Belly argues in the Indian Society and Making of the British Empire, the colonial rule in India did not simply impose control from above. It worked through existing social groups, local elites, and new forms of collaboration. This created new patterns of power, where traditional structures were reshaped rather than completely replaced. In other words, colonial rule was not just extraction. It was also a process of reconfiguration of society. By this stage, India's position in the world economy had fundamentally changed. As K.N. Chaudhary helps us understand, earlier Indian ocean networks were based on relatively balanced exchanges. Under colonial dominance, these networks were reoriented. India shifted from a major participant to a subordinate component in the global imperial system, from center to periphery. Now, when we step back and look at the entire transformation, the difference becomes clear. The European presence in India was not just another phase of external interaction. The earlier powers entered, adapted, and integrated. But this time, the system itself was restructured. This was not integration, it was colonial restructuring driven by extraction. Not just disruption, but transformation with consequences. Across this episode, we have traveled through centuries of history, from early contacts to conquests, to empires, and finally to integration at scale. And through all these phases, one pattern remained constant. India was never peripheral. It was always central. Which brings us back to the fundamental question: why India? Not why India was invaded, but why India was worth pursuing, worth controlling, and worth competing for. In other words, why was India the grand prize? The most common explanations often point to political fragmentation, internal divisions, or military weaknesses. But these explanations are incomplete, because many regions in history were fragmented, yet they did not attract sustained external interest. Weakness alone does not attract empires. Value does. One of the first elements that defines India's uniqueness is its civilisational continuity. As noted historian A.L. Bashan describes in The Wonder That Was India, the Indian civilization is marked by a remarkable continuity across millennia. Political powers changed, dynasties rose and fell, but the underlying civilizational framework remained resilient. This continuity created stability, and stability created long-term value. India was not just a territory, it was a civilizational space. But continuity alone does not explain attraction. India was also an economic powerhouse, as Angus Madison shows in The Contours of World Economy. India accounted for a significant share of global GDP, that too for much of the recorded history. Its agricultural productivity, thriving crafts, and large population created immense economic output. This made India not just prosperous, but indispensable in the global economy. Wealth attracts power, and India had both. But India's importance was not confined within its borders. It was deeply embedded in global trade networks. As K.N. Chaudhary argues in Trade and Civilization in Indian Ocean, the Indian Ocean was a vast interconnected system of trade and exchange, linking multiple regions. And India stood at the very center of this network, connecting the East and the West. This meant controlling India meant influencing wider global flows. India was not just rich, it was strategically located. So when we bring these elements together, a pattern begins to emerge. A land with civilizational continuity, economic strength, global connectivity. This was not a marginal region. This was a core zone of world history. But even this is not the complete explanation, because there is something deeper, something structural that made India consistently attractive across the centuries. And that lies in the relationship between land, people, and power. The Indian subcontinent, with its fertile river systems, monsoon patterns, and diverse ecological zones, supported high levels of agricultural productivity. As Professor Irfan Habib explains, the strength of pre-modern Indian states depended fundamentally on their ability to extract the surplus from agriculture. This surplus was not just economic output, it was the foundation of power. But land alone does not produce wealth, it requires people. India historically supported a large and dense population, capable of cultivating the land, producing the goods, and sustaining the armies. As Angus Madison indicates, India's demographic strength was closely tied to its economic weight in the global system. This created a powerful combination: abundant land and abundant labor, which meant India could generate at scale. But surplus and population do not automatically create power. They must be organized by the state itself. From the ancient kingdoms to the Delhi Sultanate to the Mughal Empire, Indian political systems or Indian polities developed systems to extract and manage the revenue. Historians emphasize that the effectiveness of these states lay in their ability to institutionalize the revenue collection. This created continuity. Even when rulers changed, the underlying system often remained functional. Empires came and went, but the capacity to govern remained. Another key factor behind this continuity was adaptability. Indian political systems were not rigid. They adapted to the new rulers, new administrative practices, and new cultural influences. As Satish Chandra notes, successive regimes in India often built upon the existing structures rather than replacing them entirely. This allowed for continuity even amidst change. Now, when we bring all these elements together, a deeper pattern becomes visible. India functioned as a self-sustaining system where agricultural surplus supported the population. Population sustained the production and armies, and the state extracted the revenue and maintained control. This cycle reinforced itself across centuries, which meant India was not just valuable, it was consistently valuable. So the answer to our question becomes clearer. India attracted empires not just because of its wealth, but because of its capacity to generate and sustain that wealth. But even this is not the final piece of the puzzle, because there is one more dimension that connects everything we have discussed: the relationship between power, perception, and ambition. India was not only wealthy and well organized, it was also widely known. From Greek accounts to Arab geographies to later European writings, India consistently appeared in the imagination of the wider world. This visibility mattered because power moves not only towards what is valuable, but towards what is perceived to be valuable. India was not hidden, it was known and desired. Once a region becomes known for its wealth, it inevitably enters the arena of competition. India became a space where multiple powers sought influence and control. From the Achaemenids to the Greeks, to the Central Asian powers, and to the Mughals, different empires were drawn in the same orbit. This was not a coincidence. It was the result of India's consistent value. Value creates attention. Attention creates competition. But by the early modern period, something begins to change. The direction of power starts to shift. Earlier powers approached India largely through the land routes. Now the new powers begin to arrive from the sea. However, the Europeans did not enter an empty space. They entered an already well connected system. They did not discover India, they entered it. When we bring together all the threads of this story, the answer becomes crystal clear. India was the grand prize because of its civilizational continuity, because of its economic strength, because of its strategic location, its agrarian and demographic capacity, its political adaptability, and its global visibility. These factors together made India not just attractive but consistently indispensable. India was not a weak target, it was a structural center of power. So the real question is not why was India invaded? The real answer is India was too valuable to be ignored. Thank you.